Today I'm going to tell you a story given to me by a man named Sam. And Sam only gave me this story under the contingency that he wanted everyone to know that he's 100% not a believer in paranormal. He's always been the type of guy that kind of scoffs at people when they start talking about Bigfoot and Loch Ness monsters and other things that he just can't explain. He doesn't care to hear about them. And even after the story that I tell you today, he still does not believe in other paranormal activity. But what he does know is that something in the woods on this day, something was not right, and he still can't explain what it was. For those of you catching this as my first video, I'm relatively new to YouTube. This is my, I think, 8th video. If you enjoy my content, I would love to get the opportunity to earn your like and subscription. But without further ado, let's get into today's story. In the late 70s, Jason and Sam were pretty good friends. They played on the football team together, their dads were friends, and they would often go out hunting up in the Adirondacks together. The men would both graduate high school in 1979, at which point Jason would end up enlisting in the military. He was joining the Marines. And only 2 months after graduating high school, Jason would end up being accepted into the Marines program, and he would go down to his boot camp, where Jason and Sam would kind of drift apart and lose contact with each other. By the end of 1979, Sam would also follow in his footsteps, but instead of going into the Marines, he would join the US Air Force. Jason and Sam would both serve their country, for Jason 6 years and Sam 4 years. Then the men would both return to their hometown in upstate Pennsylvania. The two really wouldn't reconnect with each other until their 10-year reunion. This is well before social media days, and they didn't have a good way to be able to communicate with each other outside of just picking up a phone and calling them directly. So at their 10-year reunion, when they stumbled into each other, they were very excited to hear about what they had done. Jason didn't know that Sam had gone into the military. He just assumed that he had moved away. While at their 10-year reunion, Jason and Sam would talk about the days when they were used to go hunting and camping with their fathers up in the Adirondack Mountains. And then they had this great idea that why don't they do it again? So they kind of tentatively came up with this plan that they would take a Friday off, go up to the Adirondacks in a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and have fun just like the olden days. And they picked a time frame that would work for both of their work schedules. It wasn't the first opening weekend for hunting season, but it was a couple of weeks in. Sam doesn't specifically remember which one it was, but it wasn't the opening weekend. Fast forward a few weeks, and when that Friday would come, both of the men already had their time off scheduled for work. Sam had breakfast with his wife before he said goodbye to her. He already had the ATV loaded up on his truck, which he would bring to Jason's house. Once at Jason's house, they would move the ATV over to his truck, load both of them up, and they would use that on their trip. Jason had recently gone through a divorce about 6 months prior, and he was very ready to get out of the house and go and do something exciting. So once they loaded everything that they needed to up in the truck, they would set off for the road about 4 hours north up into the Adirondacks. And on the drive, the two men would continue to catch up on some of their high school stories. They talked about when they were playing football, and they talked about some of the girls that they had back in high school. They just had a good time catching up on things that they hadn't talked about in years. After a few hours, they would arrive at the T-junction in a road where the paved road would continue straight and then off to the left, while a dirt road would go off to the right. And that dirt road would continue back about 2 to 2.5 miles, and that was the direction that they were going to take. The expectation was that they would go out to the end of this road, park their truck, unload their ATVs, and then drive those back deeper in the woods where they would set up a tent and other things that they would need for their hunting trip. It was a pretty bumpy dirt road, but when they got to the end of it, they would park the truck, pull the ramps down off the side of it, undo the ratchet straps, and unload the ATVs. They brought extra gas, and they had a cooler, tents, they had tree stands. It was a pretty large endeavor for just a couple of days out in the woods. But this trip was never really about hunting, though. It was about reliving their glory days and just catching up with what they had been up to over the last decade. It had been more than 10 years since either men were out into this hunting location, probably closer to 12 years. But Sam recalls that the direction that they needed to take was off of this dirt road and kind of down a chained off logging road, which they would be able to go pretty fast on their ATVs down. But then everything got pretty wooded, and they would only be able to go 5 to 10 miles an hour as they kind of chicaned through the woods. And once they made it off that old logging road, they did get lost a few times, but it was pretty easy to get back on track. There was a ridge that ran along the right side of where they were driving, and so they knew they just had to follow that ridge up to an area where there would be a creek that would cut into the ridge, and then you could come back out again. And that was the location that they would always hunt. And so about 2 hours later, they would arrive at that location. And once they did, they found some of the old stumps and the areas that they had been. It was the exact location that they were at 12 years prior. They unloaded everything off their ATVs and they started setting up their tents. Each of them had their own tent, along with Jason brought a cooler with plenty of cold, refreshing beverages. After about 20 minutes, they had their tent set up and most of their things inside. It was getting pretty late in the day and they knew that they didn't have a location picked out. They didn't have anywhere to go and it was already about 3:45 in the afternoon. So they just decided to call it a night. They would make dinner, set up everything that they needed to for the morning, and then go out and scout some of the game trails. So Sam got the fire started while Jason got some brats out. That was going to be their dinner for the evening, and conversation started to turn from their high school days to more of their military days. So they started sharing some of these military stories, some of them good and some of them bad. They would continue talking well into the evening when dusk was already set, and they were several beers into their night. Sam recalls at one point hearing some deer off probably 30 yards away from their camp, and he got pretty excited. If the deer were that close, then the hunting must be really good when tomorrow comes. And around the same time when they heard that deer 30 yards off the campsite, they also heard a very strange noise that Jason and Sam both couldn't make sense of. They were maybe 10 miles away from the nearest road, cabin, or anything that looked like civilization. So what they heard next was a little bizarre. Off in the distance, in the same direction that that deer had been, they heard a young girl. It sounded like a young girl saying help. But it wasn't somebody in distress. It was just a long, drawn-out help without anything else behind it. Jason said it didn't sound like a girl. It sounded more like a deer call. Maybe a fawn was bleating for the mother, and bleating is a term for deer call. Sam thought that was much more plausible and went along with what Jason's explanation was. But just to be sure, they popped up their flashlight and started scanning the woods in the direction where this sound was coming from. And they didn't see anything. There was nothing off in the woods. There wasn't a bear or a deer. They didn't see any movements. And they also didn't see the reflection of eyes off in the woods. Although it was probably just a baby deer, it was bear country, so both men were on high alert for what could be out there. After 30 seconds of scanning in that location, they would also use the flashlight to scan a 360-degree perimeter around their camp just to get a bearing of what was out in the woods. And they didn't find anything, so they put their flashlight down and kind of just waited looking at the fire. Their conversation had not resumed at this point. And about 20 seconds later, they heard the light footsteps that they heard earlier start to walk deeper in the woods, coming from the same direction where the deer bleat was coming from. Sam felt pretty guilty that if there was a young girl out there and she needed their help, he wanted to at least make an effort. So when they heard these footsteps, he called out, "Hey, do you need any help?" But the footsteps just continued to walk away and there wasn't a response. Sam and Jason kind of looked at each other a little confused that there's weird noises that were going on out there. But after about a minute, the beers took over and they just continued their conversation anyway. Coupled with the 4-hour drive to New York, along with the 2-hour drive into their campsite, they had a pretty long day. So at about midnight, they kicked over the fire with dirt and decided to crash out for the night. Around 3 a.m., Sam would wake up to the same sound from earlier, the one where a baby deer was calling out for its mother. But to him, it still sounded like a girl was saying help. And he just sat there and he listened for a few minutes to see, was it going to continue this sound? But what he heard were footsteps were walking around his tent. And it was only about 8 to 10 feet away from his tent. It was not far. And he could hear it continuing its way around its tent, back behind, around to the left side, over between him and Jason's tent. The footsteps would stop, and then after about 30 seconds, they would continue deeper into the woods away from their tents. He wanted to be very cautious about this because if it was a bear, he didn't want to get caught in a compromising position. The next morning, they had plans to wake up at a normal time, have a breakfast, and start scouting some of the game trails. But when they unzipped their tent and stepped outside, their chairs were missing. They weren't sitting at the fireplace where they were the night before when they went to bed. So they looked around the area and they found that their chairs had been pulled about 75 feet back in the direction that they had taken to come into the camp. After Sam told Jason about what he had heard the night before, they both agreed that it probably was a bear that was in their area, and they had pulled the chairs away. Maybe they had brought juices or something like that on them, but the bear had pulled these chairs away down the trail that they came in. It was about 8:30 at this point, and the men had just finished up making their breakfast. They had eggs along with some bacon and sausage, put everything together, and made sure to bear-proof it up in the tree. And at that point, they made for their ATVs and wanted to try to scout the area and look for game trails that they could potentially hunt that night. Now, the area that they were in, they had their campsite kind of along the side of a bluff. It wasn't a mountain, but it wasn't a hill either. It was kind of a ridge line. And the ridge line was about 150 feet up to the east, and you could see it running along the skyline. And then down to the west was kind of a ravine, and the creek had cut into the area that they were at. And so what they were going to do is follow this ridge line up to the north, looking for a place where a game trail would cross over this mountain ridge and down towards the creek. In about a half a mile to the north, they found the perfect location. There was a little bit of a cut-in to the ridge line, which had a game trail that walked straight down to the creek area where deer would cross to get water. So Jason set up his tree stand on the east side facing the ridge line, and 100 feet to the west, Sam would set up his tree stand facing down towards the creek. So no matter which direction these deer would come from, they would both have an opportunistic shot at them. And once these tree stands were in place, Jason and Sam would get back on their four-wheelers, and they would be going around the area just kind of checking things out, surveying the land, and then they would head back to their campsite. The plan was that they would eat an early dinner. Once they were completed, it would be about 2:15, and then they would start to hike back out to where their tree stands were at. They didn't want to take the ATVs because it could scare some of the animals in the area. So Sam recalls starting the hike at about 2:30 that afternoon. The sun would set at about 4:30, so they wanted to be in place well before that because animals move around the most around dusk. They knew that they were about 10 miles away from any sorts of civilization, so it should only be animals in their area. But as they were hiking back up to their tree stands, they looked up at the ridge, and Sam noticed that there was a silhouette of another hunter up on the ridge looking down in their direction. They didn't want to say anything though because they were on their way to go hunting and didn't want to scare anything in the area. But they were very surprised that another hunter would be in the area. He was silhouetted against the sky, so they couldn't really make out what he was wearing or what he looked like, but they could tell that he was a taller guy, maybe 6 or 6.5 feet tall. So Jason took a mental note of the fact that there was a hunter to his southeast so that he wouldn't take any shots in that direction. And given the fact that he was in a tree stand, most of his shots would be going in a downward trajectory anyways, so they weren't too concerned about crossfire. About 20 minutes after leaving their camp, they would arrive at their tree stands, and Jason would climb his, and then Sam would climb his as they watch out over the landscape. Sam would take note on how eerily quiet it was. They didn't hear birds, they didn't hear animals or squirrels rustling in the leaves. They didn't hear anything. It was dead silent. And by about 5:15, the sun was completely down and they weren't able to take a shot if they had one. So both of the men would yell out to each other and climb down from their tree stands. But they would leave the tree stands in place for tomorrow morning where they would come back out for dawn. As they started to hike back south, Jason would turn on his flashlight and just kind of guide the way along the ground. And still, the area was dead silent. Even now that night has fallen, the only sound that they could hear were the leaves crunching under their boots as they were walking. And by the time they made it back to their camp, the rest of their evening was rather uneventful. They set up and they made their dinner, they had brats again, and then they would set off to bed around 9 o'clock so they could get up early for the dawn hunt. But they wouldn't get a full night's sleep in. Something woke them up again in the middle of the night. This time it was Jason that heard it first. And it was the sound of a bear or some large animal messing around with their ATV. The ATV was only a couple of feet from his tent, maybe 3 or 4 feet, so he could hear it clear as day just on the other side of his thin tent wall. This time, 100% certain that it was a bear, he just sat and listened. He had his gun close by and a knife in his hand, just in case anything were to happen. He would hear a loud bang sound and then running off into the distance. They gave it another minute and Jason said, "Sam, did you hear that?" Sam was wide awake already and heard the same exact thing. So the two men would give it another couple of minutes and then they would open their tent with their flashlights drawn. When they shine their flashlight off to the left side, they see that Jason's four-wheeler had been flipped on its side. Now these are 400-pound four-wheelers. They're extremely heavy for one person to be able to flip it. So they're pretty confident that there's a bear in the area at this point, and they start shining off into the woods, and Sam starts yelling, "Hey bear," and Jason starts shining off further to see what he can see out there. But there's no eye reflections and there's nothing else in the area. So the guys both get out of their tents with their guns still in hand and they go over by where Jason's four-wheeler is and they start to push it back over and flip it upright. And as they're doing that, they hear it as clear as day this time. It was not a deer call, it was a young girl from about 30 yards deep in the woods saying, "Help me." But she was saying it in a very monotone voice, nothing that indicated that she was in any sort of trouble or she actually needed help. Both men at this point have their guns in a low ready position, pointing at the ground, while their other hand has a flashlight scanning the woods. Then they start to march out in the woods to try to find, is there really a girl out here with a problem, or are they just hearing things? They slowly walk their way around through the trees, off to the right side, and then they circle back around to the left side. But at no point do they find anything that's out there. They don't hear a girl, they don't see an animal, there's no squirrels, they don't hear an owl. It's just them. Either their minds are playing a joke on them or that hunter that they saw earlier is playing a joke on them because something is not right out there. There's noises that are coming from all over their campsite. Something is moving their camping chairs and it's flipping over their four-wheelers and it's making these girl noises out from the woods. They know for a fact that something is not right. They just don't know who's playing the joke. After they conduct a perimeter sweep around their campsite, they come back into the center and start talking about, what is this thing? what is messing with us or who is messing with us. It's been 10 minutes now and they haven't heard anything, but they expect it's going to make a noise again soon. It's been doing this and messing with them all weekend long. Neither of the guys would say that they were scared or intimidated of what was happening, but they made sure to stoke the fire and kept it roaring for the rest of the night. And they would try to doze in and out of sleep for another hour and a half before they were to get up and start heading back to their tree stands. They still wanted to get one more hunt in before they would go back home. At this point though, given what happened to them the night before and what happened to them the day before that, both of the guys were feeling very uneasy and just ready to be done with their hunting trip. Again, they heard no animals. There were no birds or squirrels or deer. Nothing was in the area again, and by 9:30 the guys were getting frustrated and they got down from their tree stands and they started hiking back out to their campsite. But on their way back, they saw that hunter up on the ridge again in the same area that he was in before. So at this point, Jason says, you know what, I'm done with this guy. I'm gonna go back, I'm gonna get a four-wheeler. We're gonna come back here and we're gonna confront him and find out where's he from, what's he doing here, and is he messing with us? And so that's what they would do. They would make their way for their campsite, but when they got there, they found their campsite had been torn apart. The tents were still standing, but their cooler was open, and their eggs and their bacon and sausage and everything was thrown around the camp. Their beer was open, things were spilling all over. The food was all spoiled. But the interesting part is that whatever animal did this didn't eat their food. If it was a bear, it would have ate their eggs or the sausage, but it didn't eat anything. Now Jason was steaming. So without saying anything, him and Sam both jumped on four-wheelers and then they started booking it north towards the ridge where that hunter was at. And sure enough, he was still there. Sam's thinking, this guy's a statue. He's been there all weekend long and watching over this ridge. Can't be a real person. And as the guys would approach this hunter, they were about a half a football field away. And as they were getting closer, the hunter's face would snap over and look at them. And that's when they realized that wasn't a hunter. They had no idea what it was. And it stood up, took two giant steps, maybe 6 or 7 feet apiece, and off the backside of the ridge. No move that this thing made was human-like, but they had no idea what it was. Sam stops his four-wheeler and looks at Jason and says, "Did you see that?" And Jason, lacking all bravado that he had 5 minutes earlier, says, "Yep, I'm just done with this place." And they start making their way back to their campsite to get out of there. They had to do a little bit of backtracking because from where the ridge was, they had to go down southwest to their campsite, then back to the north to their tree stand, and then pass back down to the southwest to get to where their truck was. And as they passed by the area their campsite was, the same hunter creature thing that was standing on the ridge line was standing just on the other side of their campsite. And the only thing they heard was in this loud female shrieking voice of, "Get out, get out, get out." And that's exactly what they did. They made it back to their truck as fast as they could, and when they got there, unlike their trip out, both men were silent. They weren't talking about high school and they weren't talking about their military days. They didn't have anything to say. They were speechless of what they had just seen. They loaded up the ATVs and with a sort of dejection, they got into the front cab of the truck and just started making their way back home. And that's it for the story. Sam and Jason didn't know what they ran into on that day. It was something unlike that they have ever seen before. And Sam would admit that he still has not told his wife the full story. He told her that he had seen a bear out there and it kind of spooked him a little bit as close to their campsite, but they just didn't know what it was. Thank you everybody that stayed this far. That's it for the story. Hopefully I've earned your like and subscription to the channel. And until next time, thanks again.